The alley reeked of damp concrete and desperation, a place where hope seemed to vanish under the flicker of a dying streetlight. Marcus Tate, a man whose very existence challenged the stereotypes of his skin, stood cornered, heart pounding like a war drum. He wasn't just a lawyer, was a beacon of justice in a city that often turned its back on people like him. It was supposed to be a routine evening. Marcus, 38, had just left his office at the prestigious Coleman and Hart law firm, his briefcase stuffed with case files for a pro bono clienta young black man facing a wrongful drug charge. The air was crisp, the kind of autumn night that made you pull your coat tighter. Marcus, in his tailored navy suit, was halfway to his car when the screech of tires shattered the quiet. Two police cruisers skidded to a halt, blocking the narrow street. Officers spilled out, their voices sharp, barking orders like they'd already decided his guilt. "Hands up! Now!" Officer Daniel Hayes shouted, his flashlight blinding Marcus. The beam caught the sweat on Marcus's brow, turning it into a shimmering accusation. Beside Hayes stood Officer Laura Kinney, younger, her hand twitching near her holster, her eyes darting between Marcus and the ground. They saw a black man in a dark alley. That was enough for them. "I'm just walking to my car," Marcus said, his voice steady but laced with the exhaustion of a man who'd faced this script too many times. He raised his hands slowly, the briefcase dangling from his left. His ID, the one that could end this, was buried in his wallet, but reaching for it now felt like signing his own death warrant. "Drop the bag," Hayes snapped, stepping closer, his posture rigid with authority. Marcus complied, letting the briefcase hit the pavement with a dull thud. Papers spilled out, legal briefs, evidence of his client's innocence. The sight only seemed to fuel Hayes's suspicion. "You think you're smart, huh? What's in there? Drugs? Stolen goods?" Marcus's jaw tightened. He'd spent his life proving people wrong. From the teachers who doubted he'd make it out of his South Side neighborhood to the law school peers who whispered he'd only gotten in through quotas. Now here he was, a partner at one of Chicago's top firms, reduced to a suspect in seconds. "I'm a lawyer," he said, each word deliberate. "My ID's in my wallet. Let me show you." "Don't move." Kinney's voice cracked, her hand now on her gun. The air thickened, every second a tightrope walk between truth and tragedy. Marcus's mind raced. He knew the statistics: black men were 6 times more likely to be killed by police than their white counterparts. He'd argued cases about this very thing, sat across from grieving mothers, promised justice. Now he was the one staring down the barrel of a system he'd spent his career fighting. Hayes smirked, misreading Marcus's calm as defiance. "Lawyer, huh? You don't look like one." The words stung, not because they were new, but because they were so predictable. Marcus's dark skin, his broad shoulders, the way he carried himself with quiet strength, it all fed into a narrative older than he was. To Hayes, he was a threat first, a person second. The alley seemed to close in, the walls echoing with the weight of history. Marcus thought of his daughter, Aisha, waiting at home, her science project due tomorrow. He'd promised to help her finish it. He thought of his wife, Lena, who always worried when he worked late. He couldn't let this be the night they got that call. "I'm reaching for my wallet," Marcus said, his voice louder now, cutting through the tension. Slowly, "I'm not armed. I'm Marcus Tate, partner at Coleman and Hart. Check my ID." His eyes locked on Hayes, daring him to listen. Hayes hesitated, his flashlight wavering. Kinney's grip on her gun tightened, her knuckles white. The moment stretched, a heartbeat away from chaos. Marcus's hand moved toward his jacket pocket, every inch deliberate, his breath shallow. He could feel the officer's eyes boring into him, their training clashing with their biases. The wallet came out, black leather catching the light. He flipped it open, revealing the ID that bore his name, his title, his truth. Hayes snatched it, his face unreadable as he scanned the card. Kinney stepped closer, peering over his shoulder. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of the city. Then, Hayes's expression shifted: shock, then something like shame. "You're a lawyer?" he muttered, almost to himself. "Not just a lawyer, Marcus said, his voice low but unyielding. I'm the one who's going to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. The words hung heavy, a promise and a challenge. Kinney's hand dropped from her gun, her face paling as the reality sank in. They'd almost made a fatal mistake. But the tension didn't break. Hayes handed back the ID, his jaw tight. You should have said something sooner, he said, as if Marcus hadn't been trying to de-escalate from the start. The deflection was infuriating, but Marcus held his tongue. He'd learned long ago that winning these moments wasn't about shouting, it was about surviving them. As the officer stepped back, Marcus retrieved his briefcase, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. He could have walked away then, but something in him refused to let this moment fade into just another story. You need to do better, he said, looking Hayes dead in the eye. This city deserves better. Hayes bristled, but Kinney looked away, her silence louder than any apology. Marcus turned, his steps deliberate, carrying the weight of every black man who'd stood in his shoes. The alley faded behind him, but the fight was far from over. Back at his office the next morning, Marcus sat at his desk, the city skyline sprawling beyond his window. The encounter replayed in his mind, each detail sharp enough to cut. He'd spent years building a career on justice, defending the voiceless, challenging a system that too often failed them. But last night, he'd been the voiceless one, his credentials reduced to a gamble against prejudice. His phone buzzed. Aisha's school had texted about her science project presentation. Marcus smiled, the warmth of his daughter's ambition pulling him back to the present. He typed a quick reply, promising to be there. Then he opened his laptop, pulling up the case file for his pro bono client, Jamal Carter. The parallels were stark. Jamal, 22, arrested on flimsy evidence. His life derailed by a system that saw his skin before his story. Marcus had taken the case because he saw himself in Jamal, in every young black man who deserved a chance to be heard. The office was quiet, the hum of the city a distant pulse. Marcus's colleague, Sarah Coleman, knocked lightly on his door. A white woman in her 40s, Sarah was the firm's co-founder and one of Marcus's fiercest allies. She'd fought alongside him to take on more pro bono cases, pushing back against the firm's profit-driven partners. You okay? She asked, her eyes scanning his face. She knew him too well to miss the strain. He told her about the alley, his voice steady but raw. Sarah listened, her expression darkening. This is why we do what we do, she said finally. But it shouldn't have to happen to you to prove it. It's not about me, Marcus replied. It's about the next guy who doesn't have an ID to pull out. He leaned back, the weight of the night settling deeper. Sarah nodded, her silence a vow to keep fighting. By noon, Marcus was in court, standing before Judge Eleanor Grayson, a no-nonsense woman whose rulings were as fair as they were firm. Jamal sat beside him, his hands clasped tightly, his eyes fixed on the floor. The prosecution's case was thin circumstantial evidence, a shaky eyewitness, and a police report riddled with inconsistencies. Marcus had seen it all before, too many times. Your Honor, he began, his voice carrying the weight of last night's encounter. My client is a victim of a system that rushes to judgment. The evidence doesn't hold up, and neither does the narrative. He laid out the case with precision, dismantling the prosecution's claims piece by piece. Jamal's arrest, he argued, was a product of the same bias that had cornered him in that Aaliyah bias that saw guilt in skin color before facts. The courtroom was silent, every word landing like a stone. Judge Grayson's eyes narrowed, not at Marcus, but at the truth he laid bare. When he finished, Jamal looked at him, a flicker of hope in his eyes. It was the kind of look that kept Marcus going, the kind that reminded him why he'd chosen this path. As the judge recessed to consider her ruling, Marcus stepped outside, the autumn air sharp against his skin. His phone buzzed. A voicemail from Lena. Aisha's asking for you, she said, her voice warm but tinged with worry. Come home soon, okay? Marcus closed his eyes, the alley flashing in his mind. He'd go home, but not before he made sure Jamal did too. Back in the courtroom, Judge Grayson returned, her expression unreadable. "Based on the evidence presented," she said, "I find the defendant not guilty." The words hit like a release valve, the tension draining from Jamal's shoulders. He turned to Marcus, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you." Marcus nodded, but his mind was already on the next fight. The alley had been a wake-up call, a reminder that justice wasn't just a courtroom battle, it was personal. He thought of Officers Hayes and Kinney, of the system that emboldened them. Change wasn't coming fast enough, but he'd be damned if he didn't push it forward. That evening, Marcus sat with Aisha at their kitchen table. Her science projector model of the solar system sprawled out between them. Her laughter filled the room, a sound that grounded him. Lena watched from the doorway, her smile soft but knowing. They didn't need to talk about last night. She saw it in his eyes. As Aisha explained her project, Marcus's thoughts drifted to the wooden crate in that alley, the handwritten note that could have been his epitaph. Justice fights back. He'd make sure it did. For Jamal. For Aisha. For every soul caught in the crosshairs of a broken system. Marcus Tate drove through Chicago's South Side, the city's pulse thrumming beneath the weight of its history. The victory in Jamal's case felt like a small crack in a towering wall, but the alley incident clung to him like damp clothes. He'd won in court, but the real fight against a system that profiled men like him was far from over. His hands gripped the steering wheel, his mind replaying Officer Hayes' smirk, Officer Kinney's trembling hand. They hadn't apologized, hadn't acknowledged the line they'd nearly crossed. Marcus knew they wouldn't. Most never did. At home, Aisha's chatter about her science project filled the air, a bright counterpoint to the storm in his chest. Lena sat across from him at dinner, her eyes searching his. "You're quiet," she said, her voice soft but pointed. Marcus managed a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just thinking," he said, cutting into his chicken. Aisha, oblivious to the tension, launched into a story about her teacher's praise. Marcus listened, nodding, but his thoughts were elsewhere, in the next case, the next alley, the next moment where his skin might be his only crime. The next morning, Marcus met with Sarah Coleman at the firm. She'd arranged a meeting with a local advocacy group, the Chicago Justice Alliance, to discuss systemic reform. The group's leader, Reverend Isaiah Brooks, was a towering figure in the community, his voice a blend of fire and compassion. Marcus had admired him since law school, when Brooks's sermons had fueled his resolve to fight for justice. Now, sitting across from him in a modest community center, Marcus felt the weight of their shared mission. "Your story," Brooks said, leaning forward, "it's not just yours. It's every black man's story in this city." His eyes, sharp and kind, held Marcus's. "But you've got a platform most don't. That ID you pulled out? It's a weapon. Use it." Marcus nodded, the words sinking deep. He'd spent years wielding his law degree like a shield, but Brooks was right, it was more than that. It was a megaphone, a chance to amplify the voiceless. "I want to do more," Marcus said. "Not just in court. Out there." He gestured toward the window, where the city sprawled, its beauty marred by inequity. Brooks smiled, a spark of approval in his gaze. "Then let's start something. Campaign. Community forums, legal clinics, police accountability boards. You're not just a lawyer, Marcus. You're a survivor. People will listen." The idea took root, a seed of hope in the ashes of that alley. Marcus spent the next week diving into plans with Brooks and Sarah. They mapped out a series of town halls, starting in the South Side, where distrust of police ran deep. Marcus's encounter became the campaign's rallying cry, "Justice fights back." The phrase, inspired by that imagined note on the wooden crate, was plastered on flyers, shared on social media, and whispered in barbershops and churches. It wasn't just a slogan, it was a promise. But the work wasn't without resistance. At the first town hall, held in a packed community center, Marcus stood at a podium, facing a sea of faces, some hopeful, some skeptical, all weary. He told his story, unvarnished, his voice steady but raw. The crowd listened, their murmurs growing as he described the flashlight's glare, the gun's threat, the moment his ID became his lifeline. When he finished, hands shot up, voices clamoring to be heard. A woman in her 60s, her hair streaked with gray, stood first. "My son's been stopped 5 times this year," she said, her voice trembling. "No charges, no reason. Just his skin. What's your campaign gonna do about that?" The room erupted in agreement, the air thick with shared pain. Marcus leaned into the microphone, his heart racing. "We're demanding accountability," he said. "Body cams on every officer, independent reviews of every stop. We're pushing for policy change starting with training that forces officers to confront their biases." He paused, meeting her gaze. "And we're building free legal clinics to fight every wrongful arrest. Your son deserves that. We all do." The room quieted, her nod a small victory. But not everyone was convinced. A young man, barely 20, stood, his voice sharp. "You're a lawyer. You got out. Most of us don't have that ID to flash. You really think the system's gonna change for us?" The challenge hung heavy, a reminder of the chasm between Marcus's privilege and the reality of those without it. "You're right," Marcus said, his voice softer now. "I got lucky, but that's why I'm here. If I don't use what I have to fight for you, then I'm no better than the system I'm trying to change." The young man sat, his expression unreadable, but the room felt differentless, divided, more united. The campaign gained traction, but so did the backlash. Online, anonymous accounts flooded X with vitriol, calling Marcus a race baiter, and the campaign a witch hunt against police. At the firm, some partners grumbled about the optics of Marcus's activism, warning it could cost clients. Sarah shut them down, but the pressure was real. Marcus felt it most at home, where Lena's worry grew with every late-night meeting. "You're taking on too much," she said one night, her voice tight. "What if they come for you again?" "They already did," Marcus replied, his hand finding hers. "I can't stop now." Lena sighed, her silence a mix of pride and fear. The tipping point came a month later, when Marcus received a call from Reverend Brooks. Officer Hayes, the man who'd cornered him in the alley, had been caught on body cam roughing up another black man, a teenager, barely 16, accused of loitering. The footage, leaked by a whistleblower, went viral, sparking protests across the city. Marcus watched the clip, his stomach churning. The boy's fear, the officer's aggression, it was the alley all over again. Brooks organized a march and Marcus agreed to speak. The day was cold, the sky gray, but thousands turned out, their signs echoing the campaign's mantra. Justice fights back. Marcus stood on a makeshift stage, the crowd stretching before him, a tapestry of anger and hope. He spoke of the alley, of Jamal, of the boy in the video. "This isn't about one officer or one case," he said, his voice rising. "It's about a system that sees us as threats before it sees us as people. We're not asking for justice, we're demanding it." The crowd roared, but Marcus's eyes caught a familiar face near the stage. Officer Kinney. She stood alone, her uniform replaced by civilian clothes, her expression unreadable. Marcus paused, the weight of her presence sinking in. Was she here to listen, or to report back? He didn't know, but he kept speaking, his words for her as much as the crowd. After the march, Kinney approached him, her hands shoved in her pockets. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice low, "for that night. I didn't know who you were." Marcus studied her, seeing the conflict in her eyes. "It shouldn't matter who I am," he said. "No one should have to prove their worth to stay alive." She nodded, her silence an admission. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. The campaign's momentum grew. The city council, under pressure, agreed to fund independent oversight boards. Marcus's legal clinics expanded, offering free representation to dozens of wrongfully accused. Jamal, now free, joined as a volunteer, his gratitude fueling his own fight for justice. Marcus felt the tide shifting, but he knew it was fragile. Change always was. One evening, as he helped Aisha with her homework, Marcus got a call from Brooks. The teenager from the viral video, DeAndre, wanted to meet. Marcus agreed, driving to a small diner where DeAndre sat, his hoodie pulled low. The boy's eyes were wary, but he spoke with a quiet strength. "I want to sue," he said. Not for money, for accountability. Marcus took the case, pouring himself into it. In court, he faced Hayes, who sat stone-faced, his badge no longer a shield. The body cam footage was damning, and Marcus's arguments were relentless. When the judge ruled in DeAndre's favor, ordering Hayes' suspension and mandatory retraining, the courtroom erupted. DeAndre hugged Marcus, tears in his eyes. "You made them see me," he whispered. That night, Marcus stood in his backyard, the city's hum a distant lullaby. Lena joined him, her hand slipping into his. "You're changing things," she said. "I'm proud of you." Marcus squeezed her hand, the weight of the fight still heavy but lighter with her beside him. Aisha ran out, holding a drawing of the solar system, her smile brighter than the stars above. The alley was a memory now, but it had sparked something unstoppable. Marcus knew the system wouldn't change overnight, but every case, every march, every voice raised was a step. He thought of that wooden crate, the note that never existed but lived in his resolve. Justice fights back. It wasn't just a slogan, Anna Maria, it was his life's work. What's right and wrong in a system that judges before it listens. Share your thoughts on justice and community because every voice matters.